For years, his name was only spoken in hushed tones, like a shadow that haunted the corridors of power. Carlo Maria Viganò, once a towering figure in the Vatican, once a voice inside the very walls of authority, had vanished from public sight. Exile, they said. Silence, they whispered. Some declared he was broken. Others insisted he was defeated. But those who thought his voice had been buried forever were gravely mistaken. Because on this day he returned. Not with rumor, not with second-hand reports, not with the fading notes of a forgotten letter. No, Vigano returned with a message. A message sharpened by years of silence. A message aimed not at the masses, not at the politicians, but at one man, Pope Leo XIV. It was an unexpected confrontation, the kind no one believed would ever happen. For Pope Leo XIV was unlike his predecessors. The first American pope, a man loved by the world yet scrutinized by the shadows. He was both beacon and battleground. To address him directly was no small gesture. It was to place a torch at the very edge of dry straw. And Vigano, knowing this, lit it without hesitation. The letter, carried quietly and read aloud in corners of Rome, struck like thunder. It was not the voice of a weary exile. It was the cry of a man who refused to die in silence. His words, heavy with accusation yet burning with conviction, were aimed straight at the papacy. And as those words traveled, as they reached the ears of priests, bishops, and laity alike, a strange heaviness fell over Rome itself. Because this was not just another critic. This was the return of a figure whom many feared and others revered. And the message he carried, what it revealed, was unlike anything heard before. It reached past politics, past ceremony, past polite diplomacy. It tore through illusion, exposing the very nerves of the Church. And when his words reached Pope Leo XIV, the world stilled. The question was no longer whether Vigano had returned. The question was whether the Church itself could withstand what he had just unleashed. What he revealed was not a plea. It was not even a warning. It was a declaration, sharp, unflinching, and so piercing that even those who despise him could not look away. And what he declared next left even Rome in silence. But before we dive further into this confrontation, pause. Consider where you are hearing these words. Comment below the place you are watching from, for history is about to be unveiled before your eyes. And if you cannot bring yourself to subscribe to Holy Shadows after hearing this, then confess in the comments why you choose silence when truth itself is crying out. Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò was not always a man of exile. Once he had walked the very corridors of the apostolic palace with authority, his presence commanding both respect and quiet deference. Trusted as a diplomat, a servant of the Church whose hand shaped decisions behind closed doors, he navigated the delicate intersections of faith, politics, and conscience with a skill few could match. He had been both insider and guardian, a man who saw what few were ever permitted to see, secrets of power, the quiet machinations of influence, the unseen struggles of those who sought to uphold the Church's mission. But Vigano's conscience led him down a path that many feared to tread. When others chose silence to preserve comfort, he lifted his voice. When others bowed their heads to the convenience of compliance, he lifted his eyes toward the truth, regardless of the cost. He challenged compromises, questioned alliances, and refused to allow the Church's sacred mission to be muted by the language of expedience. For this courage, he was branded divisive. He was called a traitor, whispered about as a disruptor, condemned as a stirrer of unrest. Yet in the shadows of exile, where many thought his influence had ended, millions across the world still looked to him as a prophet crying from the wilderness. His absence had not diminished his power. It had only deepened the hunger for his return, making the world eager to hear his voice once more. Facing him, though not yet in words, stood Pope Leo XIV, a man both celebrated and scorned, a paradox draped in white. He was the first American pope, a shepherd who had risen in a time of fracture, burdened by the inheritance of centuries of secrecy and power. To some, he was the reformer chosen to break chains of corruption, a figure whose courage might restore faith to those long disillusioned. To others, he was a man of compromise, walking too close to the edges of modernity, a presence that made traditionalists uneasy. Loved by crowds who saw him as approachable, compassionate, and attuned to the needs of the faithful, he was simultaneously scrutinized by those who feared the erosion of sacred order. In him, hope and suspicion walked side by side, each step of his ministry examined under both reverence and doubt. The world around them was restless. Whispers filled the church, rumors of reform brushing against the weight of resistance. In the pews, ordinary believers wrestled with devotion and doubt, praying for guidance, yet questioning the currents they could not see. Within the cathedrals, priests wondered which path history would choose, uncertain whether to cling to tradition or embrace the winds of change. In the press, headlines spun a story of crisis, a church caught between light and shadow, between memory and transformation, each article fueling the flames of tension. Cameras followed every word spoken in Rome, capturing the flickers of emotion, the subtle gestures, the invisible battles that unfolded within the Vatican walls. And into this climate of chaos, into this furnace of suspicion and spectacle, Vigano's words fell like fire, igniting debate, stirring conscience, demanding attention. This was no longer about the return of one man. It was no longer a tale of exile or personal vindication. It was about something far greater, something that transcended personalities and positions. It was about the soul of the church itself, about its capacity to hold truth above compromise, mercy above expedience, and light above shadow. Would it remain a house of truth, a sanctuary for the faithful, or would it crumble under the weight of fear, corruption, and the allure of worldly power? Would it walk boldly in the light of the gospel, or descend quietly into the shadows of political calculation and self-preservation? These were not questions posed by journalists or theologians alone. They pressed upon every heart still willing to believe, every soul still seeking holiness in a world increasingly bent on compromise. They demanded reflection, courage, and the resolve to act, not in grand gestures, but in steadfast fidelity to what is right and true. Viewers who remain passive here, refusing to subscribe, choose to watch the struggle for truth from the sidelines. Is that truly where you wish to be when history is written, when the soul of the church hangs in the balance, and when the voices of conscience rise to meet the call of destiny? When Vigano's words first reached the Holy Father, they did not arrive as thunder, nor as a storm of outrage. They came instead as a quiet, cutting wind, a deliberate probing that brushed across the foundations of authority with surgical precision. His opening challenge was carefully cloaked in respect, yet beneath that veneer, iron sharpened each syllable. He did not shout, nor hurl accusations with reckless abandon. Instead, he posed a question that seemed, at first, almost innocent, but whose weight pressed upon the conscience with the force of inevitability, enough to shake stone foundations and stir the still air of the Vatican halls. Holy Father, he wrote, measured, formal, unyielding, the people deserve light, not shadows. They deserve to know the truth of who governs them, and under what influence decisions are made. They deserve to see the church unmasked, without the veil of hidden hands or hidden motives. Will you grant them this light, or must they remain forever in the darkness? The question was simple in its form, but devastating in its implication. It cut not at personalities nor at titles, but at the root of trust itself. It named no names, it pointed no fingers, yet it exposed a question that had lingered silently in the minds of millions. Was the throne of Peter guided by the gospel alone, or by hidden corridors of influence that few dared to examine? Vigano's words were a mirror reflecting the anxieties of the faithful back upon the seat of authority. They carried the weight of conscience pressing against the walls of tradition, demanding acknowledgement. Pope Leo XIV received these words with a calm that only years of discernment and trial can teach. He did not reply in haste. There was no trembling, no impulse to defend or deflect. Instead, he allowed himself a moment, a pause that seemed to slow the very air around him, a breath measured and deliberate, as if he were weighing the soul of the question itself. When his voice finally rose, it was steady, resonant with dignity, and layered with the quiet authority of a man who had seen storms both within the church and within his own heart. His authority was not granted by the applause of men, nor by the fear of critics. It was given by heaven, and he spoke with that certainty. "My duty," he said, measured and calm, "is not to defend myself, nor to silence my accusers. My duty is to serve the poor, to comfort the grieving, to guard the faith of the simple and the lost. Transparency is not a word, it is a life lived in service. Every day, I place my life at the altar for the sake of the people of God, not for applause, nor for recognition, nor for the comfort of those who measure devotion by appearances." The sparring began in earnest, polite, yet charged with subtle force. Vigano's questions pressed with suspicion, seeking cracks in the papal shield, probing for moments of human weakness, while the Pope's answers offered mirrors instead of walls. Each sentence reflected the question back, transforming challenge into reflection. Each phrase acted as water poured upon fire, not to extinguish it, but to turn it into the rising steam of tension, filling the room with an air so thick it could almost be touched. Beneath the civility, however, there existed an unspoken recognition. Neither man would yield easily. One demanded truth, light, and exposure. The other embodied the very truth he sought, offering not confrontation but mercy, not retaliation but witness. The space between them grew heavy, a silence pregnant with anticipation, as if the world itself leaned forward, straining to catch the next syllable, the next turn of thought. Eyes followed, hearts quickened, and in that hush, the weight of the moment pressed upon every conscience present and absent alike. It was a dance of intellect, faith, and moral authority, one in which patience and precision held more power than aggression or spectacle. Every phrase, every measured breath, every careful pause built the tension higher, signaling that this confrontation would not be decided by volume or fury, but by the strength of conviction and the clarity of conscience. If you feel the weight of these words, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. If not, explain in the comments why the cry for truth leaves you unmoved. Vigano's restraint began to fray as his challenge deepened. The respectful tone that had marked his initial words now lingered only as a thin veneer. Beneath it, each syllable carried sharper edges, honed by years of exile, observation, and righteous indignation. He no longer questioned merely the veil of secrecy that hung over the Vatican's decisions. His accusations now cut toward the very foundations of power, pressing upon the alliances and influences he believed threatened the integrity of the Church itself. "Holy Father," his message continued, deliberate and unflinching, "there are whispers that the see of Peter bends not toward the cross, but toward the tables of power. There are fears that hands unclean with politics and globalist ambitions have found purchase upon the very walls of the Vatican. When bishops are seen in the company of men who trade truth for influence, when the voice of the shepherd seems to echo the language of politicians more than prophets, Can we pretend the flock is not betrayed? Can we continue to claim sanctity while the instruments of deception grow so close to the altar? These words carried the venom of centuries of suspicion, tapping into the oldest wound, the fear that the Church might be less a temple of God and more a throne for men. Each line pressed at conscience and legacy alike, conjuring images of corridors where decisions were made quietly, yet in ways that affected the faithful globally. Vigano's voice was not that of a casual observer. It was a relentless witness, demanding that the Church confront not just the external challenges of the world, but the internal fractures that could undo its mission. And yet, Pope Leo XIV did not answer in kind. He did not rise in indignation, nor did he trade accusation for accusation. His response arrived as a quiet redirection, a shift of focus that transformed the battlefield entirely. He spoke not of diplomats, alliances, or the abstract fears of compromise. Instead, he turned toward the human faces behind the Church's work, the forgotten, the abandoned, the silent witnesses of suffering whose lives bore testimony more powerful than any critique. "I have walked with the poor," he said, each word deliberate and measured. "I have knelt beside mothers who have lost their children to war. I have heard the cries of the abandoned, the addict, the refugee who wonders if the world has room for him at all. These are not statistics. These are the faces of Christ himself. You speak of politics as if it were the root of the Church's struggle. But I tell you, the true battleground is not in marble halls. It is in the tears of the suffering, in the silent prayers of those whom the world forgets, in the hands we lift to lift others from despair." The contrast could not have been sharper. Vigano's words carried suspicion, painted in the stark language of betrayal and compromise, exposing shadows where trust should dwell. Pope Leo XIV's response was compassion incarnate, rendered in the flesh and blood of human sorrow. One spoke of secret corridors and imagined corruption. The other spoke of broken streets, silent hospitals, and the hearts of the faithful. The duel was not of power. It was a contest of vision, a moral reckoning between fear and mercy, accusation and witness. The silence that followed the Pope's words was not weakness. It was strategy. It allowed the weight of what he had spoken to settle in the hearts of all present, compelling reflection rather than reaction. And when he finally broke the stillness, the phrase he spoke would echo long after the moment had passed. Politics divides, but the gospel unites. With that single sentence, the lines were drawn clearly. Vigano remained unrelenting, his focus on structures of power, on the betrayals he had witnessed, and on the dangers he feared could unravel the Church from within. Pope Leo XIV, steadfast and unwavering, reminded the world that the mission of the Church rests not in maneuvering or influence, but in the mercy and service toward those who bear the weight of human suffering. One spoke of betrayal, the other spoke of mercy. One demanded accountability, the other embodied witness. And the audience, the faithful, the uncertain, the world itself, was suspended between suspicion and hope, accusation and revelation. To ignore this clash is to deny the cost of truth. To watch and remain unmoved is to stand outside the struggle that defines the very soul of the Church. If you cannot stand with holy shadows by subscribing, then, at the very least, have the courage to admit in the comments why you turn away when truth stands before you. The measured edge in Vigano's words finally cracked. What had begun as a carefully restrained inquiry, a challenge wrapped in courtesy and patience, now erupted into a naked, unflinching accusation. The respect that had tempered his tone evaporated, leaving only the raw force of years spent in exile, the bitterness of watching from the shadows while the Church moved forward without him, and the accumulated weight of conscience unsatisfied. Every pause, Every careful syllable he had once used gave way to the urgency of conviction and the sting of betrayal. "So you're just another puppet of power?" he demanded, his voice sharper now, stripped of every layer of courtesy. "Another smiling face for the cameras, while hidden hands pull the strings behind you. Is this what the papacy has become? A stage for politics rather than a throne of truth? Have the shepherds forgotten the sheep they are called to protect, lost in alliances and favors that serve men more than God?" The words hung like a storm suspended over the room, heavy with moral gravity. They were not mere challenges. They were indictments. They were a public blow aimed at the very heart of Peter's successor, a question that demanded more than rhetoric and dared to confront the essence of papal duty. It was the line that could either fracture the Pope's composure or illuminate the depth of his character, leaving all who witnessed it in awe or in reckoning. Pope Leo XIV did not respond immediately. His silence stretched, not in hesitation, but in deliberate wait. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. This was a silence sharpened like a blade, a pause that allowed every soul present and every unseen observer to feel the gravity of what had just been spoken. The air thickened with anticipation, the cameras capturing not just a man, but the stillness of moral authority poised to meet challenge without deflection. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, yet carried the unassailable power of one who had walked the roads of suffering, one who had seen the fragility of human life and the weight of sacred responsibility. His words were fire tempered with mercy, a force that could not be shattered by accusation. "I have held dying children in my arms," he began slowly, each phrase weighted with personal witness. "I have walked into hospitals where no cameras followed, sat beside fathers who could not feed their families, prayed with women who buried their sons in unmarked graves. I have spoken to those whom the world forgets, and I have knelt beside them without promise, without audience, without applause. Do you call this servitude to power? No, I know who I serve, and it is not the halls of the mighty. It is the wounds of Christ in his people, the hearts broken in silence, the souls who wait for mercy where none seems to come." The room felt the moral force of his words as a tangible presence. The accusation that had sought to divide and destabilize was transformed into reflection, a mirror held up to conscience itself. Each listener could feel the truth in the cadence, the authenticity of a life devoted not to prestige, but to sacrifice and witness. Then came the line that shattered the silence, cutting across the weight of suspicion and replacing it with an unassailable moral clarity. "You call it naive to protect the innocent? I call it sacred." The word struck like thunder. No one spoke, not a breath, not a movement. Those poised to challenge, to critique, even to question the Pope's every syllable felt their own convictions falter. Suspicion became shame. Doubt bent before the immovable clarity of duty. This was no political maneuver, no clever retort. It was the unshakable voice of a shepherd defending his flock, of a moral authority confronting the weight of challenge with truth itself. It was the turning point, the crescendo where accusation, sharp and relentless, crashed against the rock of integrity, leaving only silence, reflection, and a sense of awe in its wake. It was a moment that would echo far beyond the chamber, viral not for spectacle, but for the piercing clarity of conscience and courage. If this moment didn't move you to subscribe, then share in the comments why you resist joining those who stand for truth. Your silence is your witness. The silence that followed was not empty. It was suffocating. Vigano's accusation still lingered in the air, yet the Pope's reply had already begun to unravel it. And now, with the room suspended between outrage and awe, Pope Leo XIV stepped forward, not with fury, but with the steady fire of conviction. "You mistake this for politics," he said, his voice calm, unhurried. You speak as if the church were nothing more than a parliament, its shepherds mere officials bound to hidden treaties. But I tell you, our call is not to sit at the tables of power. Our call is to kneel beside the suffering, to bind wounds, to guard the little ones entrusted to us. His eyes, unblinking, seemed to search deeper than words. He let the pause hang heavy, then struck the question that exposed the wound at the heart of Vigano's charge. Why does defending children make you uneasy? The words pierced sharper than any rebuke. It was no rhetorical flourish, no prepared line. It was a revelation of blind spots. The accusation against him now stood inverted. Suspicion cast not upon the Pope, but upon the accuser. Murmurs rippled across the room. Some leaned forward, stunned at the audacity of the question. Others turned their eyes downward, as if unable to bear the weight of it. Even those who had long admired Vigano felt a pang of sympathy, watching his composure falter beneath the force of that mirror. The once sharp challenger now seemed smaller, not because he was mocked, but because the truth had stripped away the armor of pride. There was no triumphalism in Pope Leo XIV's face. He did not smirk, nor did he raise his voice in victory. His dismantling of Vigano was not the gloating of a victor, but the steady clarity of a shepherd refusing to abandon his flock to shadows. And in that stillness, the power dynamic shifted entirely. The challenger, who had entered with the upper hand of accusation, was undone, not by anger, not by threat, but by truth itself. To hear truth dismantle falsehood and still not subscribe to holy shadows? Then tell us in the comments, why watch in shadows when you could stand in the light? The room, once tense with accusation and defense, began to shift under the weight of something far older than politics, far deeper than pride. Pope Leo XIV's eyes softened, and the lines of authority became the lines of a pastor who had seen too much suffering to linger in confrontation. He stepped back from the edge of debate, not conceding, but guiding the energy of the moment toward reflection. This isn't about him, he said, his voice gentle yet resonant. It is about us, about the kind of church we wish to build, about the faith we wish to pass on to the children who look to us with eyes full of hope and fear alike. It is about choosing mercy when anger tempts us, humility when pride would blind us, and unity when division whispers that we are alone. He let the words settle. Every pause carried meaning. Every silence held a moral weight that pressed upon the hearts of those listening. And then he spoke directly to those beyond the walls, to the unseen eyes watching from homes, screens, and quiet pews across the world. You who hear this, consider what it asks of you. Faith is not a shield against questioning. It is the courage to listen, to act, to love. Mercy is not a concession. It is a strength far greater than any accusation. Unity is not uniformity. It is the embrace of all who seek the truth in humility and honesty. The tension dissolved slowly, replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. The confrontation had become a lesson, a mirror for every soul, that the pursuit of truth, tempered with compassion, carries more power than any sharp tongue or scandalous revelation. We do not need more voices shouting over one another, the Pope continued. We need more hearts listening to the suffering, listening to the frightened, listening to the call that is far louder than any accusation. If your heart stirs at these words, subscribe to Holy Shadows. If not, write in the comments why you would walk away when a call to unity is placed before you. And now, as the echoes of their confrontation fade into memory, the question falls to those who have witnessed it from afar. What would you have said if you were in that room? Would you have found the courage to stand with truth, to speak for the innocent, to challenge what is comfortable but unjust? Or would you have remained silent, hiding behind the safety of your own doubts, while the world itself trembled at the weight of conscience. The arena has shifted. No longer is it the gilded halls of the Vatican or the hushed whispers of corridors. It is here, in this moment, between you and the truth. The comments become a new battlefield, a space where reflection meets courage, where honesty confronts fear, and where dialogue can rise above accusation to seek understanding. Speak, then, with respect, but speak. Engage, question, confess, and reckon with what you have seen, for silence is not neutral when truth is at stake. And as you consider your voice, carry this blessing with you. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and may the shadows we walk through always lead us to the light. May our steps be guided by clarity, our words tempered by mercy, and our actions shaped by the courage to act where it matters most. Subscribe to Holy Shadows now. If you refuse, then let the world know in the comments why you choose silence when truth knocks at your door.